you are probably dehydrated. And here's why.
Water would be nice.
Now, last month we started a series on micronutrients and started to dive into all of the different nutrients that are needed in order for your body to operate properly. However, I do want to actually back up a little bit and do a somewhat of a mini series on macronutrients, simply because I do believe that proper macronutrient intake is arguably more important than your micronutrient intake. Now, the reason I wanted to back up a little bit and do a somewhat of a mini series on macronutrients is because the number one nutrient that your body needs by far, and is by far the most important to biological function, is actually a macronutrient, and that is water. Now, the human body can go weeks and sometimes even years deficient in some specific micronutrients. However, your body can only go 3 to 5 days without water intake before you literally die. And so this is going to be a video on everything that you need to know about water. What is water? Why is it so important to biological function? How do you get enough into your diet? And how to stay properly hydrated. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So what is water? Water is an inorganic molecule that is liquid at room temperature and happens to be the only inorganic macronutrient for the human body. Now, every other macronutrient contains at least one carbon atom in its molecular structure. However, water is solely comprised of 2 hydrogen atoms bonded to an oxygen atom. And now, water also happens to be the only macronutrient that does not provide the body with caloric intake. And now, every other macronutrient, including protein, fats, and carbohydrates, do provide the body with caloric intake, whereas water is completely non-caloric, which is extremely interesting considering it is the most important macronutrient for the human body. Now, the reason that water is considered the most important macronutrient for the human body is because it is the medium for the entire human body, and the human body roughly consists of about 60% water by mass. Now, the molecular structure of water makes it a fantastic solvent for all the other molecules that make up the human body, and because it has such a relative high specific heat compared to other solvents, it is considered one of the most temperature stable solvents in existence. Now, again, you can only go a few short days without water consumption before you literally die. However, signs of severe dehydration actually become evident within the first day of going without water. And there's really no other nutrient where signs of deficiency show up this quickly. Now, roughly 60% of the water that's found in the human body is located in intracellular fluids, which are the fluids that are inside of cells. And this means that most of the water in the human body serves to maintain fluid content of individual cells within organ systems. Now, the remaining 40% is found in various extracellular spaces, such as interstitial fluids, blood plasma, cartilage and connective tissue, gastrointestinal fluids, spinal fluids, and bile fluids. And just to give you a practical touch point of just how much water is in the human body, there's roughly about a gallon of blood in your circulatory system, whereas the intestinal tract actually produces almost 2 gallons of fluid per day. But not only is water extremely important to maintain all of these organ systems, water is also used in your body as a metabolic cofactor. For instance, water is actually required by your body in order to metabolically break down proteins into amino acids, which is why one of the premier symptoms of dehydration is actually impaired metabolic function. Without proper hydration, your body literally cannot metabolize the nutrients that you're consuming on a daily basis. Now, it's also worth noting that even slight dehydration can cause almost immediate symptoms such as lethargy, decreased urine output, muscle weakness, headaches, and cramping. And what's interesting is that dark urine output is actually a really poor sign of dehydration, simply because by the time that you already have dark urine, the battle against dehydration is already lost. And that's because dark urine is a sign of severe dehydration. And the same thing goes for thirst. Once your brain recognizes that you are thirsty, the battle against dehydration is already lost, because thirst in and of itself is a symptom of dehydration. And so dark urine and thirst are actually really poor signs to look out for if you're trying to stay properly hydrated. Now, in order to get a proper grasp on just how much fluid you need to drink on a daily basis, we also need to get a grasp on how much fluid you lose on a daily basis, simply because the amount of fluid that you need to consume is directly determined by how much you're losing on a daily basis. Now, the biggest source of water loss for the average person is by far urinary output, and the average human loses roughly 1 liter of water per day through urination. Now, the second biggest source of water loss is through mild sweating, which accounts for roughly 400 milliliters per day. Now, the next biggest source of water loss is actually, believe it or not, through breathing, which accounts for roughly 300 milliliters per day, which is just slightly less than sweating. And then the last major source of water loss comes from, drumroll please, poop, which accounts for roughly 200 milliliters of fluid loss per day. Now, when you add all of these up, you get a rough estimate of around 2 liters per day of minimum water loss, which means for a completely non-active individual, you need to replace roughly 2 liters of water per day to prevent deficiency. Now, it's extremely important to keep in mind here that these estimates are for a completely non-active individual. However, for those that are exercising, water loss from sweat can actually be between 2 to 4 liters per hour of strenuous activity. And so for those of you that are exercising, which hopefully you are, this means that you could be losing roughly 4 to 8 liters of water per day, depending on the length and intensity of your exercise protocol, which means that the average individual is losing anywhere between 2 to 8 liters of water per day. However, it is worth pointing out here that this is not necessarily how much water you should be drinking on a daily basis. And the reason for this is that dietary fluid intake is not the only means by which your body meets its fluid needs. Your body actually does get roughly 500 to 1,000 milliliters of water per day from food products, and your body actually also creates water as a metabolic byproduct, specifically in things like the metabolism of glucose, where the metabolism of glucose, in order to produce ATP, actually produces CO2 and water as a byproduct. Now, your body only produces roughly 300 to 600 milliliters of water per day through these metabolic processes, but it is worth noting. Now, if we do take both of these into account, you'll notice that the body is getting water from other sources and is getting around 1.6 or up to 1.6 liters of water per day from alternative fluid sources, which does help to establish and kind of get us to a place where we can start to calculate our own personal fluid needs per day. Now, when it comes to actual fluid intake, the Food and Nutrition Board has set the estimated intake at 3.7 liters per day for the average male, and this is where the 1 gallon per day kind of rule of thumb really stems from. Now, those that exercise on a regular basis or do work outdoors in the heat may need up to 2 gallons of fluid per day, which makes the rough rule of thumb for the average human 1 to 2 gallons of water per day in order to prevent dehydration. Now, if you aren't getting anywhere near this, it is advisable that you slowly increase your fluid intake over several days, and the reason for this is you want to avoid water toxicity. Now, this is extremely rare, however, can happen under extreme conditions, and the reason for this is that if you dramatically increase your fluid intake, say from 1 liter per day to 2 gallons per day, your body will begin to dilute your electrolytes in your bloodstream and will kind of hinder nerve function to a fairly significant significant degree and can cause, again, water toxicity. Now, along these lines, it is important for us to bring up here electrolyte intake, and the reason for this is that electrolytes are extremely important in helping your body to maintain fluid balance in its proper proportions in the body. Now, electrolytes are used by your body for hundreds, if not thousands, of enzymatic reactions. However, one of their primary functions is to simply retain water, and the reason for this is that electrolytes are extremely hydrophilic, meaning that kind of water is attracted to these molecules, meaning that wherever electrolytes are, water follows. Now, the primary electrolytes that you want to pay attention to are sodium, calcium, magnesium, and potassium. And now there are a ton of other extremely important electrolytes that you can pay attention to, but in my opinion, these are the most important ones to pay attention to simply because of how many functions they carry out in the body. Now, sodium and calcium are your primary extracellular electrolytes and are primarily responsible for retaining fluid in extracellular spaces such as the bloodstream and joint cavities. And sodium and calcium are also tend to be stimulating in nature and help to carry out nerve function, which is why one of the primary signs of deficiency of these electrolytes is actually hindered neurological function. Now, magnesium and potassium are your primary intracellular electrolytes, meaning that they help individual cells within organ systems to retain water within the cell. And magnesium and potassium both are inhibitory in nature, meaning that they help to inhibit nerve function, which is why one of the primary symptoms of magnesium and potassium deficiency is stress and anxiety induced by these deficiencies. Now, we're going to take a super deep dive into these individual electrolytes when we do our video on macro minerals. However, I did feel that it was important to kind of throw this in here because of their integral role in hydration status as well. Now, the next thing to keep an eye on when it comes to proper hydration status is your glucose and carbohydrate intake. And the reason for this is that, like electrolytes, glucose is extremely hydrophilic, meaning that it helps to retain water wherever it goes. Wherever glucose is, you can also bet that water is going to be there as well. Now, not only is glucose an extremely hydrophilic molecule, but it's also worth noting here that when your body stores glucose in the form of glycogen, that it also stores water alongside those glycogen molecules, which means that even though your body doesn't have a direct means to store water, your body will secondarily store water alongside glycogen production, which means that the consumption of glucose and having high levels of glycogen is extremely important if you're trying to stay optimally hydrated. And not only is glucose an extremely hydrophilic molecule and helps to store water in the form of glycogen, but when you consume glucose in the form of simple carbohydrates and simple sugars alongside fluids, it actually helps your gut lining to passively diffuse more water across the gut lining, also improving hydration status. Now, it's also worth noting here that proper hydration status is super critical to overall testosterone production. And so if you're someone like me who is intentionally trying to optimize their testosterone levels, staying hydrated is one of my primary goals per day, not just to improve athletic and cognitive performance, but also to optimize my testosterone levels. Now, if you are curious about your testosterone levels, I always love to recommend that you guys check your testosterone levels on a semi-frequent basis. And this is simply because testosterone levels are such a great indicator of overall health and physiological function. And so if you're interested in checking your testosterone levels, I always like to recommend my friends over at Let's Get Checked, who have a fantastic at-home blood testing service, which can actually test your testosterone from home. And so if you are interested in something like that, feel free to check out the description down below for a link to that, as well as a code to get 30% 10% off of your test. And a huge thanks to Let's Get Checked for sponsoring this video. But other than that, guys, if you are interested in supplements that can be used and proven supplements that can be used to improve aspects of health like testosterone levels and muscle and performance, as well as sleep and recovery and stress, there is a complete guide to supplementation that walks you through all of the proven supplements that can be used for those health goals in the description as well. But other than that, guys, that's all I have for this video today. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below, and I will see you guys next time.